everyone to this slightly unusual Gold Coast Meet the Profession event. So whereas we would normally be hoping to be at the Hilton, say, at Surfers Paradise, looking at the lights of Surfers and having a glass of champagne, hearing from a fabulous panel and then having an opportunity to chat afterwards, we're doing it this way tonight. But what I want you to all make sure you do is take the opportunity to type your questions into the chat box, and you can do that while the presenters are speaking. I'll then be managing the question and answer session after the presentation. So, but feel free to start typing questions into the chat while the presentations are going on. So I'll just introduce you to our speakers. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge Fiona Fitzpatrick, our clinics director, who has joined us, who many of you would know, and who's responsible for making sure that even in these strange times, many of you still have opportunities to get some practical work experience through the clinics program. I'll also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we variously meet and pay respects to their elders, past and present, and acknowledge the wisdom and generous spirit of those elders. And now I'm very pleased to introduce our three panelists to you this evening. So we have Mia Bellauer has joined us. Now, Mia is a partner at Stone Group Lawyers. She specialises in commercial litigation, but most importantly, from our perspective here at Griffith Law School, Mia has given generously of her time on numerous occasions at numerous events in recent years to support our school and our students and to inspire our students. And she's done so beautifully on many occasions, and we thank her for joining us tonight on this slightly different occasion as well. Amy Hones is a junior family lawyer at BGM Lawyers. Amy graduated from the Gold Coast campus at Griffith in 2018 with her Bachelor of Laws and Bachelor of Business. She was the competitions organiser in her final year, and I have to say I have never come across such a well-organised student ever as Amy. Wow, she did an amazing job organising those competitions, and I'm sure she's brought those amazing organisational skills to her role as a lawyer now as well. So thank you so much, Amy, for coming along and giving back and speaking to our current cohort. And then we've got Jonathan Nice, whose name appears on screen as Millie Cooper. That's just a little quirk, but his name really is Jonathan. And Jonathan's also a graduate from our Gold Coast campus. He graduated in 2014, with the Bachelor of Laws from Griffith at the Gold Coast. And he specialises in criminal defence work and corporate regulatory law. And he's also stayed connected with the law school, has attended quite a few alumni events when we used to have them in person. Hopefully it won't be too long before we'll have some more of those. But most importantly, has been a volunteer lawyer at our Innocence Project at the Gold Coast. So thank you so much, Jonathan, for that generosity. And we look forward to hearing from you tonight. So we'll start with Mia. And the task that we've given our panellists is to speak a little bit about practicing law at the Gold Coast, but particularly in this COVID-19 context. And I know that it's of concern to a number of our students who are coming up towards graduation and looking for employment. So it's just interesting, and it will be interesting to hear from our panellists about what practicing law is currently like at the Gold Coast. So if I could ask you to start for us, Mia, please.
Yeah, thank you, Therese. Well, and also thank you for your lovely introduction. That was very kind of you, and I'm extremely happy to always support the Griffith University with any initiative that I can, particularly when it comes to welcoming and developing junior lawyers into the community. It's extremely important to me, and so I'm delighted to be here tonight and to talk to you and the students about what I've seen the effects of COVID-19 to be. I guess from the outset, it goes without saying it is unprecedented. No one saw this coming. This has been a huge experience of adaptation for community, particularly for our legal community. It's been, we've seen people struggle, and then we've seen people succeed. It's been, for our firm, an extremely busy time, and unfortunately the busy times come out of people's misfortune. So it's a time that we need to be really sensitive to others around us. We need to reflect on what's happening. We need to be mindful about what's uncertain in the future, and we need to adapt. So we at Stone Group Lawyers, we've really had that in front of mind. We shut our firm down quite early as a law firm when we decided to take Jacinta Ardern's lead. Whatever she did, we did. So when New Zealand was shut down, they went into lockdown. Stone Group Lawyers went into lockdown too. So that was about 3-ish weeks before Australia did it. And it gave us an ability to work out those teething problems and give everybody a little bit of a peace of mind, because we've got people in our firm who have elderly family that they live with, they've got young children, and there were risks that we were just not prepared to take. So we were in a position to adapt quite quickly to that. And what all of that meant was we just didn't know. We just didn't know at the time, but we just wanted everyone to be safe. Since then, we have found that from the perspective of what's happening in the legal market, I think some law firms are extremely busy, others not so much, and it depends on the area of law that you're in. So the firm that I'm a partner in, we are a multidisciplinary firm where we have a commercial litigation insolvency section, which is what I'm the partner of. We have a family law section, property section, and corporate commercial. And so it's different in every area. So corporate commercial is a little bit quieter. Having said that, there are interesting IPOs that are going on with organisations that you would never even dream that would be doing roll-ups or getting floated on the stock exchanges. A lot of sanitizing companies, funnily enough. There are online businesses that seem to be going extremely well. Property, that's kicking along, where residential property is extremely busy. Commercial property, not as much, but not so slow. Family law is out of control. And sadly, a lot of domestic violence is moving out of what we've found from COVID. And then commercial litigation, interestingly, is extremely busy. We were expecting to have a lot of insolvency work, and then that's all being dictated by government regulations, because there was a moratorium in relation to bankruptcy notices, statutory demands, and wind-ups of companies. So that was supposed to, there was a 6-month period where that was never going to happen whilst COVID was on, and now the government's extended that through to the 31st of December this year. So what I can see is there is a huge pipeline of work in that commercial litigation and insolvency aspect of what's happening in the market. But there's a lot of firms that are sort of hanging on, going, well, when is this going to happen? So it's a bit horses for courses, and if the firms can hang in there to get through that break, I guess from an insolvency perspective, I think it will be quite fruitful. It's almost like and we reflect on this at a more experienced level in our firm, is when the GFC hit. No one saw that coming, but everybody, you had to adapt, and that's just what it was. And it was really, really busy, and I think we're going to see that. From an economic perspective, I mean, COVID has been devastating, and we haven't seen the effects of that yet. It will. I'm expecting those changes, and I mean, Amy will be able to talk about what's happened in the family law perspective, and Johnny in crime. But from a community level, or from an economic level, we haven't seen the worst of it, and we haven't even started. We're only at the beginning. But having said all of those things, in my view, there has been a significant silver lining. And our silver lining has been the adaptation of the courts and the adaptation of technology, and how all of this has worked. So sadly, for some of the judges that I appear before, they've had to see my poodle Pepper a few times, but I see it as a positive thing, because once upon a time I was driving to Brisbane 3 times a week, dropping my children to school at 6:30 in the morning at before school care, and rushing up and spending all the money putting the children into care, to go up for sometimes just 15 or 20-minute mentions in the Supreme Court. I've got the ability now to do that by telephone or Zoom. It's significantly cheaper for the clients to have me appear in this way. It's also been really interesting because in Queensland we have, and I know that the Chief Justice, Catherine Holmes, has spoken about this publicly a number of times, which is the Department of Justice and Attorney General and the Supreme Court and the upper courts are trying to work to improve technology, because at the moment Queensland's the only, I believe, the only state where we don't have online filing, and we don't, and that means that, you know, we're all been pushing for registries in different places, but there is a way to deal with that, and just with that is online filing takes a lot out of it. Having appearances by telephone or via Zoom, like we're doing tonight, has been extremely successful, and it's just a different way that, you know, when you're on all of these committees and you're trying to get progress takes time, and we haven't had the luxury of time, and it's just gone done, and we've done it. And I think, I mean, I sit on a couple of different boards, and I am on community liaising groups with the QLS, with my other presidents of the DLA, and we're all finding that, and everyone believes it, that how we've been able to adapt in Queensland with the courts, it's been extremely successful. So I'm hoping that we're able to grasp onto that success, turn it into something better, and I'm pretty confident that the legal industry in Queensland is going to go from strength to strength. So, I mean, I guess it's a bit of a watch this space, but in summary, I guess I think that COVID, whilst it's been absolutely devastating impact for the world, for us here on the Gold Coast, I think the law students are actually, if they stick in, and I really actually need to make this point because we talk about it a lot. After GFC, a lot of law students couldn't get a job, and they left the law, or they diversified. They went in-house, or they, you know, went to London, or you know, did another trade and used their law degree as a part of that. We're finding now that there's a significant lack of talent in that sort of 10-year space. they're not around. They've gone. They're probably making, you know, lots of money doing other things. But I think if you stick in it and you get through this, I think 10 years time, it's going to be exceptionally, well, it will strengthen the core or the fabric of the legal community, particularly here on the Gold Coast. I would hate to see that there are law students that exit because of COVID. I think that there is a lot of work on at the moment. People really need good lawyers, and if you're in a position to find yourself an employer who's able to put you through your PLT or whatever, I guess you know, my sentiments is just work really, really hard, stick with it. This is if you choose law as your profession, if I can say anything, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And just work with it and keep going and don't give up, because there is going to be a day where it will be extremely fruitful. And right now, you know, the legal industry needs really, really dedicated lawyers. So I think that COVID hasn't impacted, and I think it's actually, it's made things busier. So we'll watch that space.
Thanks so much for that, Mia. And I'm sure there'll be some questions at the end. And it's really interesting what you say about the silver lining, and in a way, I guess, enabling practitioners, particularly women, to better balance. You know, we've spoken for years about work-life balance, and it seemed impossible in the legal profession, but it's like the first have been forced. Yeah.
And I think, and it's a really good point that you raised, Therese, because I think sometimes employers were, they were not convinced that working from home was going to work. Well, guess what? Everyone had to work from home, and it's worked extremely well. So I think it's adjusted attitudes from the top down. I think that it certainly has helped women. Probably me as an exception, when I had, you know, children hanging on my back when I'm trying to have conferences or, you know, whatever. But it is a sentiment like we can get through this, and we were all in it together. And I think that the flexible arrangements that workplaces are going to be able to offer now is also incredible. So, I mean, more, as I said, silver linings. And I don't think this has been a bad thing for us.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mia. I might now call on you, Amy, if you would like to tell us your perspectives. You're on mute, Amy.
Perfect. Can you hear me now? Great. In terms of, I suppose, a family law perspective and also from a junior lawyer perspective, I think I'll speak a little bit about those parts of it. From the starting point as well, so family law is intense on any day, and if you put the COVID situation on top of that, it just kind of exploded in a sense. So people were under extreme kind of social isolation, financial pressure, and unfortunately an increase of domestic violence we did unfortunately see occur. In the family court alone, I understand that there was a 40% increase in urgent applications because, like Mia touched on, it's just an unprecedented kind of climate that we're dealing with, and particularly where there's issues that have a direct impact on clients' lives. They want answers as soon as possible, because it's not like they can just kind of turn it off in that sense. For clients, I suppose, in terms of their perspective and how we've dealt with that, so we've seen a lot more of an increase of clients requesting, obviously, meetings via Skype, Zoom, mediums like that, and telephone, which for family law matters, it's a little bit interesting because sometimes people do take more comfort in seeing someone in person, which, you know, it just becomes a little bit more challenging in terms of building rapport. But it's been really beneficial for clients who, say, want to obtain advice from interstate or wherever they are, even internationally for some clients. from, I suppose, the client's economical perspective as well. So we've almost seen a shift in some clients contacting the firm where they now have access to, I suppose, superannuation funds, so they can obtain legal advice, which they may not have been able to have gone through with before. And I suppose a big difference for clients as well that we've seen is that they're appearing via, Microsoft Teams in a court environment, which, you sort of prepare a client for that intimidating environment where you have to attend the court in person, and it's very confronting, even for some clients putting on a suit. So that's been sort of nice for some clients to just be able to, I suppose, come to our office or be wherever they are and, dress professionally from up here, but may not be from down below. So they can kind of be comfortable in that sense. From, I suppose, a practitioner perspective and, as a junior lawyer, it's quite different in that sense as well. So we worked from home for a good part of, I'm going to say, just over 10 weeks. And coming from a firm that sort of works within an open plan environment, it was very different as a junior, going from, just walking across the hall to kind of see one of the senior practitioners to actually having to arrange for a time to strategize about matters. But, there's always a silver lining in that as well, in that you had to kind of think on your feet as these things came up, and you weren't so reliant on, contacting senior lawyers and things for advice. Particularly working from home from a family law perspective as well, I think it almost at times probably felt a little bit like work was 24/7, because clients more so were contacting you at any hour of the day because it was very stressful for them, financially. And yeah, like I said before, they wanted answers as soon as possible. And for us as a practitioner, if we sort of see an email come through, sometimes if it's going to have a direct impact on their emotional state, you will just reply to it whenever's necessary. From the court perspective as well, so I hope, and I think they are talking about keeping the Microsoft Teams system in as a permanent option in the future, which will save clients a lot of costs in that sense as well, because in terms of firms that charge fees for travel and time in that sense, it is obviously saving them a lot of expense from that perspective. And it's a little bit interesting for family law as well, because the usual circumstances are that you will appear at court in person on the first sort of return date for a matter, and you'll have some significant opportunity and time to negotiate in person with the other party's solicitor. So it's almost been beneficial in having that time pressure put on, some other parties, so that you're sort of preparing more for court events to be hopefully adjourned away to keep the matter progressing in that sense. So we've done a full trial via Microsoft Teams, which was very interesting in terms of doing cross-examination via that kind of medium. I think clients feel a lot more at ease that, they're not staring right at a person who's interrogating their life. They're really just staring at a screen. It kind of makes that less emotional in that sense. And also from sort of a mediation perspective, previously if clients were attending a mediation and they'd kind of built themselves up to the day, and even if you accidentally see your former partner in the hallway, it can just give you a little bit of sense of, I suppose, realness to the situation and can drive emotions. Whereas, we've seen for some matters, it is quite beneficial just to have the mediation via the Teams platform, where you don't really see the other party, you're just liaising with the mediator. And we've seen, good outcomes in that sense. Unique to family law as well is that for parenting matters in particular, it required a lot of, I suppose, flexibility and understanding by parents, because whilst an order can be drafted, as best as possible to cover all the circumstances, it can't really cover situations like this where, for example, some schools were closed, so changeover couldn't occur there, or, most commonly, you know, the travel restrictions and quarantine complicated those types of things. The court actually also brought out sort of a COVID specific list for parenting matters. So what that meant as well is for urgent cases where there was particularly a risk to the child or it needed some urgent attention, they got allocated a court date within sort of 72 hours, and then the hearing could be conducted via Microsoft Teams, which, you know, in normal circumstances, an urgent matter still might be waiting for a list date within sort of 4 to 6 weeks. So valuable time was kind of saved in that sense. And I suppose for parents as well, in parenting matters as well, some couldn't practically see their kids because of the restrictions withholding them, and sort of had to transition that time to mediums like FaceTime and Skype and things like that. And we had quite a few cases as well come through in terms of deciding whether it was reasonable to withhold the child from time. And of course, within parenting matters, it's always the kind of child's best interest in that sense. But that sort of question hasn't been addressed before in terms of, well, what is the child's best interest in the COVID environment, particularly where you've got, you know, one party has one child interstate and the other here. So all sorts of unprecedented issues. From, I suppose, a property perspective as well, obviously, it's tricky because for some people it might be a benefit to sort out their property settlement now if sort of the valuations and things work in their favour. But for the flip side of people, you know, with loss of jobs and income earning capacities decreasing and things like that, it sort of complicates housing prices, you know, the decrease in shares, all kind of aspects of that. And I suppose we've had to be kind of quite careful in terms of simply drafting documents in this state, because you sometimes might fix a sum to be paid to another party, but now because of, I suppose, the volatility of the market, you'd do it more so as a percentage so that it's flexible and, you know, hopefully to the client's benefit in the end. Within that property sphere as well, I suppose spousal maintenance and child support, obviously, if there's orders and things in place that need to be paid, then and suddenly one party can't pay that, that's also raised, you know, a variety of issues. And sometimes there's been a lot more pressure for parties to go through sort of family dispute resolution mediums, because if the court sort of doesn't see the urgency in terms of there's a child at risk, it's just not going to be heard. The courts are just so clogged at the moment with family law matters, and of course those become priority in that sense. But yeah, I suppose overall as well, in terms of sort of turning back to the domestic violence side of things, like I said before, unfortunately, we have seen an increase in that. And I think naturally, because some parties haven't sort of spent that much time in such a close environment before, it's sort of causing that conflict that may not have been there before. And it's tricky for, you know, parties who might be a victim to domestic violence, where they feel like they can't escape almost. And also, you know, it might just be one of those decisions that some people have to make where they have to almost stick it out and live under the same roof, because practically they don't have the resources to leave that environment. So it's, yeah, it's very tricky and challenging from that perspective as well. But I suppose, yeah, turning back to sort of the profession side and, you know, from students' perspectives, I think the technology part has been, I think, the biggest shift overall, in that practitioners are more open to it. And I think speaking from sort of our firm environment, we've almost practically gone paperless in a sense, because a court right now isn't interested in a bundle of paper. We need to just be able to provide them with documents as soon as possible via Microsoft Teams. So yeah, that's, I suppose, something completely different. And, you know, we're all still becoming familiar with the Zoom mediums and the Microsoft Teams mediums. And with many of the court appearances that we're doing via telephone in particular, we still have, you know, practitioners who can't figure out the mute button sometimes, which is always entertaining. But yeah, I think overall, you know, it's almost one of the most challenging times for family law clients because, you know, their issues are tough enough and this is making them even tougher. But on the flip side, I think, you know, speaking from the profession side and the access to legal services from a family law perspective, I think it's got, you know, a silver lining. And I think, like Mia touched on, we're almost still in the midst of it. And I don't think we've seen sort of the worst of it pass just yet. But hopefully, you know, we will put into practice the positive parts of it and, yeah, carry forward some of the lessons so that we're kind of used to this environment if anything further happens in the future.
Thanks so much, Amy. And yeah, again, it's interesting that silver lining that we've almost been forced to innovate, and the fact that, you know, we've long struggled with the fact that courts can be a really intimidating environment for people, and that's somehow been overcome, particularly in things like mediations now, because people can join from the comfort of their own home.
Yeah, environment.
It's
yeah, exactly.
Really interesting that, yeah, the advances that we might make in the way that law is practiced as a result of this terrible global pandemic. Yeah. I might also, before we move on to Jonathan, and then Jonathan might want to take some of this up in his presentation, but just put to you, Amy, first, and then back to Mia. Got a couple of questions in the box just about whether you think that the technological advances and using platforms like this will mean that people could more or less work from anywhere. So we've got an example of someone working from the Gold Coast for a Melbourne firm, or you know, going to Sydney. You know, is geographical location going to become less important, perhaps? I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's probably right in terms of, you know, if you want to gain experience from a firm who are located elsewhere, I think it's definitely going to be more possible now. The only, I suppose, thing to be sort of wary of and make sure that if you do take up those opportunities is to always have sort of a contact, like a point of contact in that sense, because yeah, whilst it is a huge advantage that, you know, you might be able to work from anywhere you like, it's also really important to have that support as well, and ongoing, I suppose, professional development in that sense.
Thanks, Amy. Mia, did you have any comment on that question?
Hi, yes, I do. I think it's a really good question, because what we've seen, as I said, is a demonstration of we can do it pretty well from anywhere, and everyone has had to adapt in that sense. I've also seen, you know, some trends in terms of law firms or other large businesses which were following the footsteps of, you know, those in Napa Valley, which was open plan, stand-up desks, you know, keeping overheads down. Well, those firms can't go back to work because they can't properly demonstrate that they, well, to have a complete firm there, you can't have 1.5 metres apart. It's not working. So what is happening, our law firms are working out that the giant spaces that they've got in corporate CBDs, it's a lot of money and it's probably not all that necessary. So I am pretty well convinced that anyone who's working in Melbourne or Sydney or other places, you're going to find you can probably do it from the Gold Coast. And so those geographical locations that you know, the question is like, is that going to be important? I think probably it always will be important, but probably maybe less so. Top tier firms are always going to need a big office. Business or, you know, entrepreneurs, people want to go to a city, but maybe less so now. But it's certainly unprecedented, but I think we are going to see a lot more flexible working arrangements in the future. So if you can make it work from somewhere else and demonstrate that you can meet KPIs and your clients are still happy and all of that works, because that is the most important, part. We are a service industry. There are clients at the end of this. It's not all just about us. If it works for your clients and you can show compassion, or you can be there, or you can take them to court, or whatever is necessary, it has to work. But I definitely think that a lot of it can work from home. So I don't know that geographic location is necessarily like the be all and end all anymore.
Thanks, Mia. And there was just a follow-up comment too about the importance of personal touch with clients, which I think you were sort of alluding to. It's got to work for the clients as well, and they might want someone who they can meet face to face with. And
yeah, and it's definitely horses for courses, but you cannot forget that we need to be extremely compassionate. Well, in my view, in everything that we do, because our clients come to us at the worst point in their life, and there's only so much you can get over Zoom. And sometimes you just need to, touch somebody, or, they can feel different things that you can give if you're in person that you can't give over the phone or over a Zoom meeting. So I still think that human interaction is extremely important, and we're not throwing it out the window. We're just doing things more efficiently. That's how I think we should see it.
thanks, Mia, and thanks, Amy. And we might ask Jonathan now to take us through his experiences and insights.
Thanks, Therese. Thanks for the very kind introduction. In fact, I was just going to add to that last point that Mia was making, that is, the mid-tiers and the top tiers in the cities. The word that I'm hearing around the legal fraternity is that almost all of the top tiers are reconsidering their leases. I mean, even at a corporate sense, it's particularly amid a pandemic, it's not healthy for a firm to be paying millions of dollars in leases for 3 levels in the city, when they might now be reconsidering that and be able to pay far, far less for some meeting rooms that they can meet with clients in. So, but that is obviously on the disclaimer, as Mia was saying, that they can all operate at the same level as they can if they were all in the office. And I think the pandemic is proving that they probably can, particularly firms down in Sydney and Melbourne. I've had dealings with plenty of lawyers down there. They're still stuck at home, but they all seem to be doing fine and doing okay and enjoying it, if anything. So I think it is causing the top tier firms, the mid tier firms with large office spaces, to reconsider how they are spending their money on their office space, because they have quickly realised that that may be an overhead expense that is not necessary, given all of the technological advances we have today to get by in general day to day. But I was going to talk about, as Therese was saying earlier, I work in criminal defence predominantly, and been doing that for a number of years. As Therese said, I still help volunteer with the Innocence Project at Griffith. And so I wanted to come at things with a sort of criminal defence lawyer perspective. And I thought the best way to do that would be, rather than talk to the day-to-day points that Amy and Mia have already touched on, which has affected all firms in a similar fashion, I thought I would touch on a sort of criminal lawyer's perspective. And I thought the best way to do that actually would be through a kind of story or a matter that I had been doing recently, because I was only thinking back earlier today about it, and it was quite impacted, now that I think about it, in a number of ways from the pandemic. And so I thought I would go through that, because it might be a little bit more exciting than my boring day-to-day job. So I had been acting in a matter that finished recently in quite dramatic fashion, I suppose, but I'll come to that shortly. But it was a matter that I had been acting in for about 3 years until the start of this year. It was a long and drawn-out prosecution against my client, who was facing quite serious charges. And at the start of this year, those charges were listed for a sentence hearing in the district court. They were sufficiently serious that it was on the cards that he might face a period of actual imprisonment. And so the matter having gone on for so long and being serious to that nature was very stressful on my client at that stage. You can imagine, after 3 years of prosecution for charges of that nature, it takes its toll. So in any event, the matter was listed for a sentence hearing, and I think off the top of my head, it was listed for a sentence hearing roughly around early April. Now, I know that the COVID-19 pandemic really started to take effect here in Australia around early March, if I'm not mistaken, or late February. And what had happened is when we were approaching the sentence hearing in early April, as I said, it was at least on the cards that my client might face actual imprisonment. We were, of course, arguing that he shouldn't spend any time in prison, and the Crown was suggesting that he should. In any event, and sorry if I'm looking over here, I got a couple of notes that I was frantically writing down earlier today when I was thinking about it. But we were told about 2 weeks before the sentence hearing that there was, that the courts, now that the pandemic had hit, that they were going to drastically limit the number of people allowed in the courtroom. That had quite an effect on us, not just in the way that we had to approach the sentence hearing from a legal sense, but also, my client's family were faced with the prospect that after all this time, they might not be allowed in the courtroom to hear my client's fate. And so there was a real emotional impact on them as well as him to try and face that alone. And we were also told, when I mentioned the legal sense, we had to decide who of the legal team was going to go there. Now, my barrister, who I had briefed to appear at the sentence hearing, he was based in Sydney. He himself was already facing issues in terms of travelling up from Sydney. And it was decided only about a week before the sentence hearing that given the court's approach to having people in the courtroom, that he would appear by video link. That proved ultimately to be a real issue on the day. We couldn't manage that. There were technical difficulties. You can imagine the stress and impact that would have on a defendant and us as well as his legal team, watching that play out in the courtroom. But I went over because I wanted to be with the defendant. I was, of course, allowed in. The Crown were allowed in, but our barrister wasn't. He had to appear by video link. And as I said, there were issues with that. And so as it played out, there were other things in which it did assist us. For instance, it strengthened our argument that he should not be sentenced to imprisonment, actual imprisonment. Why? Because the jails they were significantly impacted. At one point around March, April, they were taking the view that there should be no more prisoners allowed in, that they were going to lock down the prisons completely. Now, they have since reverted back to the position, I think, where only certain people are allowed to visit the prisons under certain circumstances, but they are now accepting new prisoners. At that time, they weren't. And so any prisoners that were sentenced, I think if I can remember correctly, they would have to basically be put into solitary confinement. So you can imagine these significant effects on people that are sentenced, and the things that were at play, which we had to deal with somewhat on the run. But at times it assisted defence lawyers because, as I said, it strengthened our argument that he should stay out. Why should a person who is subject of argument as to whether he should spend a short time in prison or not spend any time in prison at all, there's good argument to say, well, if he's going to spend any time, under these circumstances, he'd be doing what we call, tough time. He'd be doing it at a time where he couldn't have his family visit him. He perhaps would be sentenced to solitary confinement, those sorts of things. And Therese, you just stop me if I'm rambling, because I can tend to do that at times. So another thing that impacted that whole exercise was at the very last minute, I'm talking the morning of the sentence hearing, the Crown made a last minute application for an adjournment. That in itself, after a 3-year prosecution, where all these things had been dropped on us on the run, where his family potentially couldn't enter the courtroom, things like that. We're facing the prospect that this might all now be further delayed because the prosecution is seeking an adjournment. And the basis for that application was that the prosecution argued that there was a reasonable possibility that he should be sentenced to actual imprisonment for the offences, and that given the circumstances and everything involved, i.e. the pandemic, that it should be adjourned to a later date. We opposed that. We lost that application, and it was adjourned for a couple of months. And so already there's a whole bunch of different impacts that we suffered because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Fast forward a couple of months, things had slightly improved. They were accepting prisoners, but there were certain circumstances to that, as I've already mentioned. We came perhaps up to, I think, 2 weeks or 1 week prior to that sentence hearing. Everyone agreed, the Crown agreed, yes, let's proceed. The circumstances are a little bit more ideal for prisoners to be sentenced, etc. Yes, everyone's happy. About a week before that sentenced hearing, we were advised by the barrister who we had briefed from Sydney that he was now having issues with coming up to the Gold Coast for the hearing, and that didn't suit us. That didn't fit with us. It didn't suit the clients either. They had felt that at the previous hearing, although it was out of our control, of course, the fact that he wasn't there, they felt that there was a significant effect on our client's ability to argue. Counsel's ability to argue on his feet on what was a sort of a last minute application, that we were always behind, always behind in that argument. And I would agree with them on that. So it didn't suit us either. So last minute, we had to brief a new barrister just 1 week before the sentence hearing on a prosecution that had been going for 3 years. You can imagine the stress levels for my client and everyone involved. That too, there was an interesting aspect to that in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, because I briefed a barrister by the name of Craig Eberhardt, who, if anyone knows his name, would know him, that he is a very reputable trial barrister. He does not do sentence hearings. He very rarely would you see him appearing on a sentence hearing, although he's very capable and competent, might I add. But he has a great reputation for being a great trial advocate. And it just so happens that because of the COVID-19 pandemic, he had no work because all of the jury trials had been essentially abandoned or adjourned. So he is a guy that normally I can't get on the phone to him because he's not available for 8 months. But all of a sudden he was out of work looking for any job that he could get, and so he could take up a brief to do a sentence hearing the following week. That wasn't an easy exercise. It's something I would never do. I would never brief a barrister just a week out of a sentence hearing in the district court. But we had to do things on the run. We had to make do, and I think that's the case with all types of areas of law. But that was how that panned out, really. And that is just one matter. As it happened in that matter, we did the sentence hearing with Mr. Eberhardt. Our client, he was sentenced to prison, and we later appealed the matter. We took it to the Court of Appeal just a couple of weeks ago, and we succeeded, and he's now out. But he was only telling me, so there's sort of a happy ending to the whole story, but he was telling me that because of the COVID-19 pandemic, there were prisoners from other correctional centres being moved around, forced into different areas, etc. He spent a lot of the time that he was in the correctional centre sleeping on a mattress on the floor, and those are the kind of circumstances they're living in the sense that, you know, I'm sure everyone here thinks, oh well, correctional centres, that they must be subject to, you know, to really strict conditions in terms of the regulators and so forth. But in reality, they're not. You know, the prisons, they make their own rules, really. And so the prisoners, I'm sure, must have faced some really harsh conditions, like my client. In fact, the day that we succeeded on the appeal, he got let out, and I think the following day they just locked down the prisons again for a short period. I'm not sure if you saw that in the news. That was only a couple of weeks ago. So it's a really tough time. Everything is so uncertain, and people just have to kind of work on the run and make do. And as Mia and Amy were pointing out, there are some real benefits to be gained from that in the future, and they have pointed that out. You know, I'm a bit of a skeptic generally, and I think as well we also need to keep in check that we don't go too far with those things. You know, from a criminal defence lawyer's perspective, who, you know, we're all skeptics, etc., and we always fight for justice. I think that that a lot of the times, you know, justice can be substituted for things that are convenient or cost effective, etc. And, you know, an example of that is, and Amy, you might be able to relate to this, because I was only talking to a family law barrister just the other day. He was telling me of the amount of trials he's had to run over the phone and cross-examine witnesses over the phone. And I can't imagine cross-examining someone over the phone. You couldn't do it as properly as you could if you were in the courtroom. And so those are the types of things that I am optimistic about it, but I am also cautious, and I think people should have concern about the end product, you know, the end goal, which is justice. From, you know, I'm talking from a criminal lawyer's perspective here. Are we achieving that if we substitute certain things to make it more convenient? And of course there are benefits to that, but there are potential downsides. I think where those things can really benefit everyone is in administration. You know, Mia was talking before about doing mentions and things like that. I agree with her entirely. You know, what's the point of driving an hour to Brisbane to do a mention when it can be done simply over the phone? But I think when you're talking about hearings and things that are much more substantive, I wish to add caution and concern to that. So anyway, I hope I haven't rambled on, but those are just my thoughts.
Thanks so much, Jonathan, and such a thought-provoking story. I mean, I think we've all heard on the news, you know, about the lockdowns and things in prison, and this COVID thing's bad enough, but to be in prison during something like that must just
That'd be frightening. Particularly, I think there was a child detention centre that had suffered an outbreak, and it just would be terrible.
Terrible. And it's wonderful to hear you as one of our alumni speaking so passionately and intelligently and insightfully about these types of issues, and also thinking about, you know, what the future should or could hold for, in your case, criminal practice, and that note of caution, I think, is a really interesting one. Because, yeah, change can be really good, but not all change.
Well, I was only thinking back, I reckon maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, the prosecution in a matter, doesn't really matter what it was about, but I think we were going to cross-examine a witness at a committal hearing, and the prosecution brought an application to say, it was a police officer from memory, and she's in Bundaberg. We'd have to fly her here, and can't we just do this over the phone? And she was a critical witness to the entire matter because she, I think, was purporting to be a direct eyewitness. And I defended that application and so forth. It was pretty standard and succeeded because there was good law at that time that no, there needs to be good reason why she shouldn't be here to give evidence in person. I can't imagine how that might go down today. And again, there are benefits, you know, if it were convenient and she wasn't a critical witness, I suppose, sure, you might approach it differently. But that's my concern is if that happened today, would I have as much success in defending that, given everyone's experiences?
Fantastic. So we're actually out of time. If there are any pressing questions that anyone would like to ask, you could speak into your mic or type into the chat box. But I'm mindful of the fact that this is a school night and people probably have things to do, like relax at the end of a long day. So if there are no questions, I'd just like to sincerely thank our three panelists. That was just such a fascinating insight into what's happening in the world of legal practice at the moment. And as Fiona has just typed in, thank to all of you for your insights into how the law has evolved with COVID and some of the new ways of working. And yes, that some of it might be here for the long term, but that, as Jonathan says, we need to tread cautiously with some of it as well. Yeah, but fascinating. And thanks so much for giving up your time. This session is being recorded, so it will be able to be shared widely with our students, and I'm sure they're going to really benefit so much from it. So we've got a couple of thank yous there in the chat box. Thanks so much to you all. That was just